everyone. Thanks for joining me. I wanted to make a quick screencast video in which we could highlight some really important points mentioned at the end of chapter 35. In particular, what's going on in the Pacific Theater during World War II. I know this is not a strong point that's studied in 10th grade, and there's some major things that are important to know, in particular, that lead to in this Pacific Theater that lead to the United States deciding to drop not one but two atomic bombs on Japan to end this conflict and the major implications that that has afterwards. So to start out, we talked about Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, why Japan attacks Pearl Harbor to really cripple the United States in the Pacific so they can keep going and taking territory that didn't belong to them. So after Pearl Harbor is attacked, Japan's strategy is definitely to hunker down. They want to seize as many natural resources as possible. They know it's a matter of time before the United States is coming back in really response to Pearl Harbor. So they're going to establish a really firm defensive perimeter. So this is the day before Pearl Harbor, what Japan had as far as land. So you can see definitely what we talked about. Manchuria, Nanking is in there on the coast of China. They're also taking parts, Britain, Tonkin, French Indochina, and they decided to take more. Pearl Harbor wasn't the only United States naval base that was hit in the winter of 1941. In late 1941, after Pearl Harbor, they're hitting Wake Island, they're hitting Guam, which we take during the Spanish-American War. Additionally, Clark Field in the Philippines, which we've had since the Spanish-American War. That was an important naval base for the United States. So again, they're really taking as much territory as possible to hunker down and get those natural resources. They additionally control an area really close to the United States, considered mainland United States, and that's the Aleutian Islands, the island chain off the coast of Alaska, which I'll show you here in a second. So again, here's the Aleutian Islands, okay, and this was one of the things we've had Alaska since the 1860s, but really Alaska was never really developed. We never put any money in for infrastructure for Alaska until World War II. So Alaska will actually benefit from what's going on here going into the 1950s. Furthermore, too, again, they're taking a lot of territory down here, mostly owned by European countries, the British, the French, and the Dutch. The Dutch East Indies right here was a chain of different colonial holdings that were really, really valuable as far as oil and other natural resources. Again, they need all of that to build that war machine. So I want to take a second to look at the Philippines. Something that happens there is really important to know early on. So as I mentioned, when they attack Pearl Harbor, they're also going to attack Clark Field in the Philippines. This was also another major base where we had a lot of U.S. planes, and they take that out as well. Within time, they quickly are able to overrun the Philippines, and we know the Philippines are going to fall. Again, we've been crippled in the Pacific. We don't have the resources nor any allies to help us out and maintain the Philippines. So unfortunately, by March of 1942, the Philippines will fall to the hands of the Japanese. And General Douglas MacArthur is actually stationed in the Philippines for the United States, and FDR sends him orders to get the heck out of the Philippines. He sends him orders saying, get to Australia as fast as you can. And MacArthur does not want to leave his men behind. Really, that was something that he was not too happy about for the rest of his life, that he wanted to stay and fight. But again, knowing that he was such a valuable asset in the Pacific, we didn't want to lose him. And so he makes that famous statement, I shall return, and he does, and we'll look at that coming up. But once the Filipino islands fall, where we see really the first experience firsthand for Americans facing the brutality of the Japanese troops. I mean, we've already talked about that with Manchuria and the rape of Nanking, but something called the Bataan Death March, will quickly happen. And this is where they're going to force right under 80,000. Right around 76,000 American and Filipino POWs that they capture to walk about 60 miles without food, without water. Many are killed along the way. Many of those that sustain injury are killed along the way. So we see a high death toll there in that about 1 week march. And so what does this indicate? this treatment that the POWs, both American and Filipinos, experienced by the Japanese. For the first time, we're really seeing what type of soldier we're going to be up against in the Pacific theater. There after World War I, there was something called the Geneva Convention, and the Geneva Convention really outlined what was proper treatment for POWs. Again, like many other treaties that we signed after World War I, there is a total disregard for that by the hands of the Japanese. So very quickly, what really fuels this type of behavior? It's very much an ancient cultural code within Japan. It's linked to within their religion of Buddhism that, everything you do is to bring great pride to not only your country, your emperor, but your family. And so this really fuels something that's known as Bushido, the way of the warrior, the code of Bushido. And it was followed by the samurai soldier, which we took a look at before the Meiji Restoration existed. But, something culturally that has not fully gone away. There's still that intense loyalty to emperor worship, and that everything you do is in the name of your family and country. And so from the view of the Japanese soldier, if you were an enemy combatant and you surrendered, they consider that to be one of the most shameful things. The samurais you see here, they oftentimes would commit something called seppuku, as ritualistic suicide, that essentially you would be sacrificing yourself, your life, to make up for the wrongs that you had just committed and to avoid the shame of defeat. So again, when they see enemies like the United States, like the Filipinos, like those in China surrendering, that's unthinkable to the Japanese soldier. And therefore, they felt that these citizens who surrendered were less than human and they deserved nothing more than humiliation, torture, and death. And so, this again, brutality is something we're going to see throughout the war in the Pacific. The next thing to take a look at is finally the United States, okay, after Pearl Harbor, which happens in the winter of 41. Finally, by the spring, in April of 42, we're able to make a comeback. And that sort of response to Pearl Harbor and that signal of the United States coming back in the Pacific is the Doolittle raids on Tokyo. So this is going to be led by Jimmy Doolittle. You see there, 16 bombers are going to attack Tokyo and other important cities. And again, it doesn't really cause any damage. There's a picture of where we hit. Doesn't really cause any damage, widespread damage to these cities. But again, it's just sort of a wake-up call. Like, here we're back. This was a very risky mission. Basically, the distance that they had to go because we're afraid of radar. Radar was in its infancy. We didn't want that picked up. So the aircraft carriers had to stay a pretty far distance back, as you can see in the Pacific. And then they were not able to turn around. That aircraft carrier quickly left after the planes took off. And so they were told to go fly and try to make your way into parts of the Soviet Union and even China that wasn't occupied by the Japanese. So this was a really risky mission for those Americans that partook in it. There's just some pictures of the takeoff and the ship. So looking at major battles, once the Doolittle raids happen, we start to quickly mobilize. And a month later, we see the first really in a series of important battles in the Pacific in which we're engaging the Japanese. Again, we're still on the defense of the United States. And the first one that's really important to note is the Battle of Coral Sea. As you can see on the map, the Battle of Coral Sea doesn't really take place in any specific land. Because it's all about an aerial fight with our aircrafts. It's all about trying to save Australia. The Japanese want to take Australia. They want to now have that defensive perimeter because they knew that we would be using Australia as a jumping off point for further attacks to the Japanese islands. So they desperately want to secure Australia. So this actually is a really important historic battle in really U.S. military history, the Battle of Coral Sea, because it's completely an aerial battle. Again, it's planes launched from aircraft carriers and fighting each other for the first time. And while there's no clear winner of this battle, it is considered a victory for the United States, although we do suffer some losses like the USS Lexington. That was actually one of the battleships that was not there that day at Pearl Harbor. It was out on patrol, so it was saved from that attack. It unfortunately is destroyed here. So again, this is an important a tactical draw, but essentially we do see the United States with some losses, the Japanese with some losses as far as military equipment, but it stops Japan from advancing towards Australia. And it also, too, is an important morale boost. this right coming off of the heels of that Doolittle raid, which was successful. Another important battle is the Battle of Midway. And this is a game changer. As you can see here, Battle of Midway is going to take place on the island of Midway, not too far away from the Hawaiian Islands. And what the goal is here is that the Japanese wanted to take Midway. They wanted, again, to keep launching airstrikes on Pearl Harbor as we continue the recovery of Pearl Harbor from its attack. And we just want to essentially eliminate to the Japanese any type of bombing threats from home islands, thinking we would use Midway as a jumping off point. The other part is they want to lure remnants of our U.S. Pacific Fleet there to destroy it. Take us out, and this would be the end, the final blow to the United States. Unfortunately, this doesn't, well, fortunately for us, unfortunately for Japan, this doesn't happen. So again, this is a turning point in the war because there's very heavy losses that Japanese military will experience. They lose 4 Japanese carriers. They have 250 planes lost. This is a major, major turning point in the war, really because, as it says at the very bottom here, it gave the United States now the offensive. Japan is now turning back to its home islands, and we're sort of chasing after Japan and its forces, okay, to the Japanese islands. So again, just some pictures of different torpedo Japanese warships they lose there. And the key players in the Pacific, obviously on the American side, we took a look at General Douglas MacArthur. He's going to continue to be a force. We're going to take a look at him coming up in the Korean War. Chester Nimitz is also going to be an important force in the Pacific for the United States. If you ever go to Hawaii, everything there is named after Chester Nimitz. But then on the Japanese side, again, who's really running the show politically? Militarily, economically, it's the military. That sort of transition happened as a result of the Great Depression we looked at. So the General Hideki Tojo, he's definitely going to be calling the shots. And then Admiral Yamamoto, that's sort of the architect behind Pearl Harbor and also a lead force for the Japanese in the Pacific for many of these battles. So there again, you can just see MacArthur's coming up from Australia. His main goal is to make his way back to the Philippines, which he does, and we'll talk about that in just a second. You have Nimitz coming from Central Pacific, more off the coast of the Hawaiian Islands. You also have Halsey as well, coming from the South Pacific area. And so this is a game changer. After Midway, and now that we are on the offensive, we pick up a new strategy. The strategy in the Pacific is something called island hopping. The Pacific is so large. There are so many islands there. And still with limited resources, we don't need to hit every island. But the goal is to get as close as we can within striking distance of Japan to let us set up bases. Because at this point, we're planning on ending the war possibly with a land invasion in Japan. We'll talk about that more coming up in just a second with the Manhattan Project. And this is successful, the island hopping campaign. By 44, you see General Douglas MacArthur returning to the Philippines, hopping his way all the way back there. Again, he makes good on that promise. You see the press there. This is a major event for the United States, and we definitely make sure the press corps is there to capture it. But we're still struggling and gaining grounds, and we're still seeing now backed into a corner, essentially, Japanese forces really becoming, again, very brutal in their attempts to protect their home island. And that's clearly demonstrated in probably 2 of the most well-known battles in the Pacific, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. So Iwo Jima is going to happen February to March of 1945. As you can tell, this is not an easy battle. It takes several weeks to secure the island. Island of Iwo Jima is about 700 miles away from mainland Japan. And take a look at that casualty rate. 23,000 U.S. troops are going to be killed and wounded. The Japanese is going to be much higher than that. We see a lot of different attacks in which essentially bonsai attacks where you see the Japanese, blowing themselves up, taking out other American GIs. It was hard to fortify this island because it's mostly volcanic rock, and the Japanese had dug deep with a network of tunnels throughout Iwo Jima. So again, we thought we had secured the island in about the first week, but we will continue to make sure we fight to secure that island for several weeks after. And that's the famous image of the U.S. Marines, raising the flag on Mount Suribachi on the top of the island of Iwo Jima. And again, they did that on the second day of the battle, but it took several more weeks in order to secure it. Another important one is the Battle of Okinawa, and this definitely will shape some decisions moving forward regarding the use of the atomic bomb. This is going to happen through April through June of 1945. It's a smaller island, about 300 miles away from mainland Japan. It looked like an iceberg sticking out of the Pacific Ocean, hence the name Operation Iceberg. This is where we run into, again, really ferocious fighting of the Japanese. There was a lot of civilians that lived in Okinawa. They will fight in this battle as well against Americans that are trying to take it. And again, we see mass suicide by the Japanese there. That had many people, especially Harry S. Truman, who will become president very shortly, question, will the Japanese ever surrender? Will they fight to death, even if the need to take and do an invasion of the Japanese islands is needed? And so that was the code name, Operation Downfall. At this point, we don't have a bomb developed. So Operation Downfall was the planned military strategy of a land invasion of the Japanese major four islands to push Japan into a surrender. And, over the years, there's been a lot of different discrepancies. The numbers are all over the place of what the United States predicted would be the casualties of Operation Downfall if we had to do a land invasion. Again, we're after the Battle of Okinawa, we're about 300 miles away from mainland Japan. And so some are as high as 1 million, others, about 100,000. The numbers are all over the place. And again, it's based off of previous battles and our experience in fighting in the Pacific. We also estimated, too, there would be a very high Japanese casualty rate among their own military, but also civilians. That last bullet that you see on the screen, they were actually educating young Japanese high school students of how to do self-defense in preparation, thinking that the United States would do a land invasion, and just take an all sharp object and aim for the stomach. Even if you kill one, that would do. So ultimately, all of this is going to lead to the decision by Harry S. Truman to drop the atomic bomb. So let's take a look at that quickly. Before Harry S. Truman takes office, this is really one of the last appearances of FDR. He meets FDR with Churchill and Stalin, the big three, for the last time at Yalta. What they're looking at here is discuss post-European war with the USSR, knowing that the war is going to end very soon in Europe, which it does. What sort of is going to be our game plan here? And then also, furthermore, what are we going to do with Japan? We definitely felt like we needed the Soviet Union support in the Pacific now that things were winding down in Europe. We kind of, in this Yalta conference, had to give in quite a bit to Stalin. Stalin wants to oversee Eastern Europe, nations that were conquered by Nazi Germany that now are going to be liberated. He wants to take control of them. In some areas, especially Poland, we give in to him quite a bit because, again, we feel that we're going to absolutely need his help in fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. If you go back and you look at that picture of FDR sitting in the middle, there's an indication there that being president now for the last several years, really through all the 1930s into the first half of the 1940s, has taken, obviously, a great toll on the man, especially considering those medical issues he had previously. But the nation is still shocked when they hear via radio. A lot of radio programs were interrupted that on April 12, 1945, FDR died of a stroke in his home in Georgia. And now Harry S. Truman, who had only been VP for a few months, had only met with Roosevelt twice and had no knowledge of the Manhattan Project or the atomic bomb until a few weeks after taking the presidency, now is the one in a leadership position. This is a famous letter by Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War under FDR, basically asking Harry Truman, saying, we have to meet. We have to talk about something that is really important, a secret matter, and that is going to be the Manhattan Project. So the Manhattan Project is actually began in the late 1940. As you can see there, becomes fully authorized, by 1941. But yeah, overall, on the top secret project, we're going to spend $6 billion plus to develop the atomic bomb. And how this project gets started is another famous letter. Actually, Albert Einstein, wrote this letter to FDR, basically finding out through other scientists that were fleeing Nazi Germany what the Germans were up to. They were trying to develop a similar weapon. Again, Einstein believed no nation should be harnessing such power and such a weapon, but knew it would be catastrophic for the world if the Germans were able to develop it. The person that's going to be not the lead scientist is going to be Oppenheimer, but the person that's going to be in charge of this project from a management standpoint is Lieutenant Leslie Groves. You see him pictured there, and he actually was an Army engineer that constructed the Pentagon in little over a year. Remember, we really didn't have an area where all branches of government could communicate. That was one of the failures that many historians believe led to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Different branches of the military, the Navy, the Army, the Marines, nobody was in clear communication. So the Pentagon is actually built right at that time period to solve that problem. So Groves is going to be in charge of the Manhattan Project. So we've been working on this project for a number of years when Truman becomes president. And, he has some options here. We can do a land invasion to end the war with Japan. We could blockade Japan. Japan had been pushed back to its home islands at this point. We can just sort of surround them with our Navy and prevent anything from getting in or getting out. There was obviously problems with that. We could see that the Japanese, again, unwilling to surrender, would possibly force starvation on its own people. So the death toll there could be pretty significant for Japanese civilians. The other option is, with the anticipation that the bomb would be developed by the summer of 1945, could we then, once we have it developed, sort of demonstrate it on a deserted island and sort of say, hey, everybody, look here at this time on this day? And would that be enough to intimidate Japan? A lot of people also believe, too, the Soviet Union might as well be part of that, because we definitely wanted to keep them in line in what they wanted to do in parts of Europe and spreading communism. Ultimately, we didn't go that route. We didn't have a bomb developed, but many people thought that would be too bit risky. If we try to do a demonstration and the bomb didn't work, that could be worse than the other previous options. We could continue to negotiate with Japan. Again, a lot of people found that difficult because that didn't work. It obviously didn't work when we were trying to negotiate with them in the summer of 41 before Pearl Harbor happened. Behind our back, they were planning that attack. So we didn't really trust them to do it. And then finally, to rely on the Soviet Union. Ultimately, Truman's sort of seeing the bomb, though, as the best option. Once it's developed, especially after that costly Battle of Okinawa, the bomb could be used to quickly end the war and save upwards of 1 million, possibly U.S. soldiers. So the last thing before we take a look at the use of the bomb is the Potsdam Conference. Again, you have some change in leadership there. Obviously, the big three now includes Truman due to the death of FDR. And the Potsdam Conference is going to happen just about a month before the use of the atomic bomb. So they meet in Potsdam to really, again, talk about post-war Europe, but also now what should be done to get Japan to surrender. There's definitely further tensions between us and the Soviets, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Cold War, about who's going to take what territory and what government structure should these countries have in Eastern Europe. But you see really Truman and Churchill, but especially Truman, not willing to give in too much to Stalin. This is a very different experience than what we had seen with FDR dealing with Stalin in Yalta. We gave much more into him because really what happens here is while Truman is at the Potsdam Conference, he gets word that we in July of 1945 have successfully tested the atomic bomb back in the United States. So the Trinity test is a really important factor into the Potsdam Conference. We now believe that we no longer need Stalin and the Soviet Union with Japan, and that way we can throw sort of our might around. Truman never tells Stalin at the Potsdam Conference that we have an atomic bomb. We successfully tested it. But again, he just says we have this new weapon, but we successfully developed it. But Stalin is not surprised by this, and the reason for it we don't find out until a few years later is that the Soviets have successfully infiltrated the Manhattan Project. They have a Soviet spy in the Manhattan Project sneaking out information. So Stalin already knows all of this, unfortunately. Again, we'll find that out after the war. And that distrust and that espionage that both the US and the Soviets used will definitely lead to Cold War tensions. So the other thing that happens at Potsdam is Truman gives Japan the Potsdam Declaration. This is basically saying, here's your ultimatum. We want you to basically surrender immediately or face this prompt and utter destruction. We never say that there's an atomic bomb or nuclear weapon. But again, you're going to have a hard time coming up if you don't do what we want. He also says, too, their emperor, which is basically a puppet, but still seen as a godlike figure to the Japanese people, would be removed from the throne. And that was a difficult point within this declaration. He makes no mention of the Soviet entry into the war or the atomic bomb. Again, here's a specific quote from it. Unconditional surrender or face that prompt and utter destruction. And so Japan's response, really the biggest thing that held them up was their military. Some political leaders there really thought it was in the best interest of everyone, especially the Japanese people, to surrender. But the military would not be convinced. The government might surrender, there were some indications, if Japan could keep its emperor. But the United States was insistent on this. Unfortunately, Japan ignores this, and historians have gone back and really looked at the issue. If we would have changed this, if we would have said you could have kept your emperor, which is what's going to happen in the end, we actually, after the bombing of Japan, will allow them, once they surrender, to keep their emperor. So if we would have already introduced that here before the bombing in July of 1945, we might have gotten a possible surrender. So unfortunately, for their silent contempt towards the Potsdam Declaration, Truman moves forward with the bombing. And that first bombing is going to take place in Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945. There's often been the tale told that this city, along with Nagasaki, was selected because they were important military centers. There were some important military areas nearby, but this was really a high civilian population. A pretty high one. Again, due to the evacuations, they're going to drop to just about 250,000 at the time of the attack. And again, both cities are going to be pretty condensed, the construction. The Enola Gay was the plane piloted by Paul Tibbets that's going to actually drop the bomb. 6-hour flight. Okay. When exactly is planned? No really bad indications of the plan changing at all. Tibbets passed away a few years ago, but when asked, what did he think it was the right thing to do? He absolutely supported it, knowing that his actions obviously led to the death of many innocent Japanese civilians. So there's a picture before and after at the museum in Hiroshima that stands today regarding the nuclear bomb and its use. And so Little Boy was the atomic bomb that was used. And you see about instantly anywhere from 70 to 90,000 people, they believe, died instantly due to the blast. But then, look at that number, 152,000. Over that, additional people will die due to radiation, a very slow, painful, and agonizing death. Nagasaki will be the next one a couple days later. Again, we give another issue for another surrender. When that doesn't come on August 9th of 1945, the United States moves forward with the bombing of Nagasaki. Again, one of the largest seaports in southern Japan. It was also, too, in the history books saying that it was a great military center. It was definitely heavy for industry, which has slowed down by that time period. But again, a very dense city where we would feel impact quite a bit. And there's some before and after pictures of that bombing. So the impact of the war, both bombings, it obviously will force Japan to surrender. That'll take place a few weeks later on the USS Missouri with General Douglas MacArthur. He'll take their their surrender, we will occupy Japan for about 7 years up until the early 1950s to help rebuild Japan, to bring back a lot of democratic practices which were lost in the 1930s when the military takes over. But ultimately, this is a big step for the United States. We're still in the books as being the only country to use an atomic bomb, a weapon, against another country. But at the same time, this will catapult us into a world power status. And really, too, at the same time, also put us in competition with the Soviets. The Soviets will quickly develop their atomic weapon by the end of the 1940s. Again, that infiltration of the Manhattan Project, they're not too far away from us. But the consequences here are obviously great for a number of reasons. But most importantly, ushering in that era of the Cold War between the US and the Soviets. All right, people, if you have any questions about anything, feel free to email me, but that will take a look at that ending part of chapter 35. Take care, everyone.